actually the new despotisms, the Turkeys, Vietnam, China, Russia, Saudi, Singapore, Belarus, are whip smart. That is, those who rule build in to their state institutions learning mechanisms, because they're aware that foolish decisions, that recklessness, can bring, like a house of cards, it can bring the whole regime tumbling to the ground because it loses popular support. And so the book details, and this is one of the really vital things for why these are new regimes. They're not like Zimbabwe under Mugabe, violent, thuggish, ruled by the fist, with no care at all for the bulk of the population. The new despotisms build in these learning mechanisms. So, for example, in the Emirates, they have a happiness program. They have happiness forums located throughout the system, where people are encouraged to tell the rulers, where to what extent they're happy or why are they unhappy. The Singaporeans have been practicing, the Singaporean one-party government has been practicing what's called the REACH program. There are teach-ins and stakeholder meetings. In China, the internet is used to build public forums, for example, in Guangzhou, where citizens are encouraged, to speak to the party about their concerns about traffic and environment and so on. So these are regimes that try to be resilient. We can perhaps talk in a moment about their weak points, but they try to build in learning mechanisms, and those who rule do so using techniques like elections, which are learning mechanisms, that they can find out the degree of popular support for their regimes, and it gives them a chance to show off. And one last comment, Tori, these despotisms, I call them phantom democracies. Those who rule do everything they do is in the name of the people. They have the gall to describe themselves as democracies, as truer democracies. Putin says it repeatedly. Erdogan says, we have a higher form of democracy in Turkey. And so these are smart despotisms whose rulers act as if they're democracies. And in my view, they are a serious alternative to power-sharing constitutional democracies, say, of the Australian type.
Which is a fairly frightening thought, to be honest. Is it that because they can, they're not sending soldiers through the streets massacring their own people, they've kind of put a veneer of charm and, as you say, the phantom democratic veneer over what they're doing. Does that make them more dangerous than a Mugabe-type regime?
Yes, because, for instance, on the question of violence, ultimately, these are regimes that rule through the fist. But the bulk of the population, certainly the middle classes, all of these despotisms have a middle class. The middle classes don't feel fear. They don't fear, a knock on their door at dawn or after midnight. That's not normal. Those who resist, of course, are subject to targeted violence. Violence in these despotisms comes stocking masked. They practice the technique. This is the phrase I use in the book. It's a Chinese proverb. They kill chickens to scare monkeys. So let's take the case of Alexei, the opposition leader in Russia, who has just probably been poisoned. The way Putin's Russia deals with opponents that's typical. It's done by usually balaclava masked, camouflage dressed thugs. The regime says, this is terrible what has happened, and we will be looking, for the perpetrators, and we will bring them to justice. Usually nothing happens. And so these regimes are police states, but they don't feel like police states for the bulk of the population. It's again another source of their resilience, and it makes them, I would say, more terrifying because of their ability to produce what I call voluntary servitude. These are regimes, despotisms that practice the art of trying to win the loyalty of their powerless subjects, and they feed upon complacency.
Well, as soon as you said about kill the chickens to scare the monkeys, I immediately thought of the Uyghurs and how China has locked up 1 million people in internment camps, called them re-education centres. Does that then just allow the rest of the populace to compartmentalise, to sort of put that to one side as they go about their normal daily lives? It gives them an excuse not to have to become a revolutionary or not to have to challenge the regime. Yes,
I think that's certainly true. Were it not for investigative journalists, we wouldn't know about the fate of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Chinese population, thanks to state-controlled media and with private platforms like WeChat, there is censorship. So the bulk of the population are very fine. Chinese people, I have many friends who are like this, who know very little or nothing about what is going on in Xinjiang. So there's simply a blanking out. There's a silencing of a pretty serious issue. And once again, were it not for investigative journalists, including, say, the BBC, some German journal, and so on, we would not know the scale of this so-called re-education program, and it's undoubtedly a strategy of diluting the population. It's a form of religious ethnic cleansing on a very vast scale.
But it gives, I guess, Xi Jinping plausible deniability, doesn't it? I mean, he can stand up in international forums and he can tell his people, and he can stand, I personally had a visit from some CCP, some Communist Party members to my workplace after I'd written about the Uyghurs, just saying, oh, you've been tricked by the fake news sort of thing. So it gives, they can hold their heads high in a sense because they have a bunch of protective phrases that they can use, which they couldn't if they had soldiers in the streets.
Yes, all of these despotisms, not just the Chinese, practice the art of gaslighting their subject populations. They spread stories that are often untrue. There's a lot of bullshit. There is what I call in the book kind of vaudeville performance. Vaudeville, say in the 1920s, was a type of entertainment where you had jugglers and dancers and fire eaters and animals and so on, something for everybody. These are media-saturated regimes, really state-of-the-art, in which there's a lot of circulation officially of stories that have a kind of disorientating effect on people, that entertain people, that encourage people to draw the conclusion, it's all politics. I don't care, it doesn't affect my life. What do I know? And when that happens on a large scale, to do, for example, with the fate of the Uyghurs, or to do with the fate of dissidents in Russia, that works to the advantage of these regimes.
And it puts me in mind of juveniles bred in circuses. As long as their stomachs are full and they've got something to look at, they're not going to worry too much about what's going on behind the scenes. But as soon as you say bullshit, gaslighting and vaudeville, of course, my brain went straight to US President Donald Trump. And now America is a democracy. And And yet that populism seems to be a bit of a crossover with the new despotism, where you've got a president who can stand up and say things that are patently untrue. And he can talk directly to his followers, as he's well known to do on Twitter. So where does the US fit into that idea of kind of fooling the masses, keeping them entertained, while actually carrying out attacks against democracy?
I think we should all be concerned, if not alarmed, about what is going on in the United States. Since 1945, it was a democratic empire. After 1989-91, it was a unipolar world in which the United States, operated on the presumption, with the reputation of it being the world's most powerful democracy. And what I say in the New Despotism book is that towards the end in particular is that there are a lot of trends going on in the United States, but in other democracies, that have a striking resemblance to life under these new despotisms. For example, the gaslighting by governments and of politicians. That there's no doubt that is that's systematic in the new despotisms. And it's a very dangerous trend where when a politician says that's fake news, that politician, typically a man, actually means by that, I don't agree with you and you don't agree with me, therefore I call you fake. But this is a destruction of truth and of honesty, of integrity in journalism. But there are other trends. All of these despotisms, it sounds strange to say, given their resilience, all of them have a big gap between rich and poor. That gap has been growing in actually existing democracies for 40 years. And then comes the populism question. So for reasons that are quite complicated, I'm sure you're aware that it's public disaffection with parties and politicians and parliaments and politics. It's public disaffection that has made the new populist attractive. It's not just number 45, as I call him. I don't use his name anymore. And it's my way of remaining optimistic. There might be a 46th, but it's not only just number 45, it's Bolsonaro, it's of course Johnson and co in the United Kingdom, it's Marine Le Pen in France. The list grows. And this new populism, Modi in India, I have just finished a book with an Indian colleague on what is going on in India. India is a very good example of this new populism under Modi. It's a more general trend. So what happens, and why it is that democracies are vulnerable to despotism, is that a party springs up that is against the establishment, and it talks the language of the people, and it says the system is rotten. They begin to win elections, and when they do get elected to office, they then begin to form pacts with usually their rich friends, or they build a dynasty, have you noticed, in the United States. It's a sort of family-run operation.
I think 6 out of 12 speakers at the convention were Trumps.
Sure, you can trust them. They don't cause any problem. Blood and money, are mixed together. And what's dangerous about the new populism in action is that it not only produces demagogues, the people is a kind of fiction, as a category. So you need a figure who embodies the people, and that's the demagogue. It's the Bolsonaros and the Erdogans, and it's the number 45s. And that mixture of a populist party, a populist government with a demagogue, begins to tamper with the public monitoring accountability institutions. So you can see these trends that are now well advanced in the United States. they pick fights with the judiciary and they try to stack the judiciary in their favor. They do not want rule of law. They do not want legal accountability. They attack all media platforms that are hostile to them, call them fake news. Typically, this is going on in the United States, they tamper with the expertise of the civil service, of public service institutions. They tame the legislature, so that a dynamic begins to unfold in which you have the centralization and concentration of power, and you have the weakening of accountability mechanisms. Well, it's clear to me that that is the recipe for building a despotism in the name of the people, using elections and calling it democratic. When Number 45 quite recently said, maybe I want more than 4 years, maybe 12 years, that I think is a very serious warning sign. It should set off alarm bells.
It was Putin-esque, I would have said.
Yes, and that, so running through the book is the idea that we should not think about democracy and despotism in terms of, you know, good guys and bad guys. It's not, these are not binary opposites, as you said at the beginning. These are not, you know, entirely different sets of regimes. What we're witnessing is a strange dynamic in which the despotisms claim to be democratic and have a kind of democratic feel to them. At least 3/4 of Chinese people, when interviewed reliably, say they live in a democracy. And on the other hand, we have democracies that are showing many signs, many symptoms of despotism. And part of the book, a key aim of the book, is that it's a precautionary tale about our times. It's an attempt to make sense of these confusing dynamics, in defense of democracy, I should say.
Yeah, we should make that very clear. Well, you don't talk much about Australia in the book, but what I took away from it was exactly your warning about when these symptoms appear, we have to see them for what they are. And immediately you can see things like the questioning of authority. You know, there are politicians, not all of them, of course, but certainly on the backbench of the coalition, certainly within One Nation, who basically revile anyone with expertise. Because, you know, you should trust your common sense. It should just be what every man thinks, sort of thing. So don't worry about the scientists. Don't worry about the, you know, logical premises leading to a logical conclusion. What are you worried about in Australia at the moment? What symptoms of this sort of despotism can you see?
Well, I think that there are 2 points, Tori. I think the first has to do with expertise and the importance of expertise in a democracy. It's true that all of the new populists, you know, who claim to be making politics in the name of the people, of the authentic people, all of these new populists express reservations, often are outright hostile to expertise, for example, in the public service institutions. And I think that that is part of the institutional takeover. That is part of the dismantling process, the dismantling of democracy. It's very dangerous for power-sharing democracy. And it ignores that expertise is really, really important in a democracy. What is an expert? Well, once upon a time, for example, in the 19th century, the expert was considered to be a kind of replacement for the priest or perhaps God. You know, scientific knowledge, knows the truth of things. It was in the 1930s that someone named Niels Bohr, who was one of the founders, the key founders of quantum, the quantum revolution that happened in the sciences, wrote about experts, and I very much agree with this sentiment, where he said, in the past we've thought of experts as kind of, godlike know-alls. But actually, we know now that, knowledge is contestable and, truth has many faces. But the true expert, Niels Bohr said, is someone whose experience, the words share a common root, experience and expert, whose experience makes them wise, who remind their colleagues that they don't know everything and remind people of power that they don't know everything. So the true expert is someone who warns about the folly, the hubris of powerful people, warns them to keep their feet on the ground, to be more cautious about things. So on the question of Australia, well, in the New Despotism book, towards the end, I raised the question of how are democracies like Australia going to deal with these despotisms? That's a very live question. How do we deal with Xi Jinping's China? How do we deal with Putin's Russia? How do we deal with the Saudis? How do we deal with the Turkish regime under Erdogan? And I say that, well, we can contemplate military action. Extremely dangerous and very unwise. We could push for a new Cold War. There's every sign that that's beginning to happen. The pressure is coming from Washington, and if number 45 is re-elected, we're certainly going to experience more of that. One of the warnings running through this book, it may sound shocking to listeners and viewers, is that we might lose that Cold War. Because not to be underestimated is the resilience of these new despotisms. The PAC is, of course, led by China, which is building something like a global empire, and it has a definite attractiveness in different parts of the world. So to come to the point, the question is, will trade sanctions work? Probably not, or not be very effective. The argument of the book is that the most effective thing elected representatives and citizens living in democracies can do is to clean up the Augean stables. Augean stables, what does that mean? The Greeks spoke about, told the story of King Augeas, who had several thousand oxen and didn't get around to cleaning the stables for over 30 years. So there was quite a lot of, shall we say, excrement. And so Hercules came in and redirected a river to clean up all of that excrement. And in the book, I say that the most powerful thing, the most effective thing is to kind of ramp up the resilience of democracies so that they become more robust, so that citizens feel more trusting of those who govern and so on. How to do it? Well, I have a long shopping list of possible reforms, which I think the Hawke Centre is known to be sympathetic towards, and I think these reforms are certainly unfinished business, whoever governs in Australia. For instance, we have several million permanent residents who do not have the right to vote. We know that a couple of 100,000 young people are still missing from the electoral rolls in a country famous for its compulsory voting. We have no National Anti-Corruption Commission. It's a scandal. We have no adequate, as things stand, representation for our Indigenous peoples. We have no protection of public service broadcasting. The list goes on. That for me is a short list of important institutional reforms that would make this a much more resilient, robust democracy. And it seems to me, in the face of fears about what is going on in the United States, is it a failing state? Is democracy dying in the United States? These are serious questions. And in the face of, dealing with our main trade partner, China, I think the resilience, the vitality, the kind of liveliness that would come from these reforms is very important. I think they're really what's needed.
And on your list, where does the media sit? Because, theoretically, the fourth estate is a conduit between the rulers and the people. Ideally, journalism is afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, but trust has become a major issue, which politicians have helped to, I guess, tarnish that trust by calling out fake news for anything they don't like. But how does the media work in, I'm not specifically talking about Australia now, but under the new despots?
Well, it's a very good question. There is, we all know there is historic communications revolution going on. It's unfinished. It began probably in the 50s and 60s. It's the digital networking of information flows, and a lot of positive things that have come from this. The fact that we can do by Zoom, a face-to-face meeting where time and space barriers are simply overcome is one of the advantages of this communications revolution that we couldn't have done in the age of the telephone, or in the age of television, or in the age of the letter, or in the age of the printing press. What's interesting about these new despotisms, Tori, is that they are all media saturated. They are all caught up in these in this unfinished communications revolution, and they can be read, as I tried to do in the book, as efforts by states together with private corporate media platforms. They can be read as efforts to harness this unfinished communications revolution. And of course, they practice censorship. Web platforms are struck down. And of course, they pump out a lot of, gaslighting reportage. All that goes on. But what is strange about these new despotisms is that they allow a measure of what I call digital mutinies. They allow protest, bellyaching, letting off steam in public. You can see this dynamic on WeChat. It's the main social media platform. Every day there are literally hundreds of disputes that go on where someone takes news and recycles it. An ordinary Wang Min, they're called, an ordinary netizen, and shares it with others. And so what can happen, and it happens regularly, is that there is some trouble caused to local officials. For instance, believe it or not, in August of last year, I was teaching summer school in Wuhan. Oh. And I made it out of Wuhan. Here I am, still healthy. Just before I arrived, there was an incident. This is very typical in China. It happens under all of the despotisms, where a woman driving a very fancy car parked her car at a strange angle on a main downtown street to go and get a coffee, caused a ginormous traffic jam. Lots of honking. When she came out, very well dressed, obviously upper middle class, people are shouting at her, and she shouts back at drivers saying, you are all rubbish. It's all filmed. Very quickly, it's learned that she is married to the district police commissioner. And so questions are then raised about their wealth. Where did she get this Porsche car that she's driving? And before you know it, that police commissioner is dismissed. So there are these power conflicts that go on within the new despotism. They're not totalitarian regimes. It's part of their whip-smart resilience that they try to have built into the system, these early warning detector mechanisms. And it's something to be understood, not to be praised, but to be understood. And I think that in this respect, one of the weak points of these despotisms is the potential resistance that comes from what I call digital mutinies. Sometimes they rock the whole system. For example, there was that moment at the beginning of this great pestilence, at the end of December and early January of this year, out of Wuhan, where doctors began to attract, through WeChat, large numbers of followers, basically pointing out that there was a cover-up going on, and that this was an extremely dangerous virus that was dealt with in a despotic way subsequently. But if democracy is to have a future, then there has to be multiple platforms that have a public service quality about them, where platforms where citizens and representatives can circulate stories that and bring to account, bring to heel powerful people who have abused their power. That, as I see it, is, it comes very close to the core of what democracy is. Democracy is a way of handling power that is opposed to bullying and manipulation, that is against the foolishness of those, the outright stupidity of those who become blinded by their own power. That's why we have periodic elections. But thanks to this unfinished communications revolution, I think that contestation of power, that bringing to heel, that attempt to inject public accountability into power relations, exposés of domestic violence, exposés of what is happening in senior citizens' residences during a pestilence. The role of journalism in its hybrid forms with citizens and official platform, the role is to expose those kinds of things, because no democracy can indefinitely allow the abuse of power which is monopolized. So that is a long-winded way of saying that platforms like the Hawke Center, like the ABC, WhatsApp groups, platforms that operate globally, I mean, these are all very important to preserve and to defend. One of the key dangers of the new despotisms is that they try to eliminate all platforms, media platforms, that don't share the ruling power's way of thinking.
Which brings, can I just bring that back then to the digital mutinies? Because it seems to me in China that maybe it acts as a sort of, like a safety valve. Like, just let them have their little mutiny over here, but it's quite controlled. And if we didn't let them have that little thing, the whole thing might go. And it reminded me of Extinction Rebellion protests here in Australia, where it's, if you're going to protest in Australia, you have to apply for permission, you have to talk to the police, you can do it at these hours, and not actually disrupt anyone else. And Extinction Rebellion, caused massive disruption. Yep. And it seemed to me there was a real intolerance revealed there to civil disobedience, that protest mutinies have to be kept in, an enclosed bubble.
Yes, I mean, if I'm right that we're living through a Shakespearean moment, a big historical transition where there's a lot of disorder and chaos, a lot of things are happening that are utterly surprising or that nobody really thought could happen. If I'm right about that, and I would say that there's a growing perception among millions of people that these times are not normal. Very big things are going on after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, the emergence of a belligerent Russia, and now a pestilence that is disordering things and causing great uncertainty. If I'm right about that, then I think it follows that complacency. I don't care about all of those, that lot. You know, they're all thieves and crooks. You know, that kind of, I don't care, I've got better things to do. Let's have a beer or a glass of wine. You know,